Major breaking news. Donald Trump wins again. His administration has just received a multi-month stay at a minimum in the fight to maintain tariffs that he believes are mission critical to bringing about fair trade for Americans around the globe. Let's break down this big win in the United States Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit when we come right back. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the Four Box of Diner, proud American gun owner, constitutional attorney, member of the United States Supreme Court Bar, and I'm proud to say the top voice of the Second Amendment in America. Thank you, 2025 Gundies Awards. All right, folks, so exciting news here. Donald Trump and his administration have won again in court. We're starting to see that the trend is President Trump's friend in the federal court system. This was not always the case this term, if you will. The first couple months, he suffered some setbacks, but now it's turning out that by and large, he's winning most of these court fights. There's still more coming, but Donald Trump is starting to chalk up or pile up a very large number of courtroom victories. The most recent one is a big one, and that is in the United States Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit based in Washington, D.C., which is the court that hears appeals from the Court of International Trade based in New York City, which I've literally, sat in front of and walked by 1,000 times down there among all the courts in Lower Manhattan. Now, as you may recall, about several weeks ago, maybe a month at this point, the Court of International Trade basically had found in a 3-judge ruling that President Trump's tariffs under the various relevant federal statutes that he was imposing upon various countries was somehow illegal because the 3-judge panel said that Donald Trump had to go to Congress and only Congress could engage and raise these tariffs, refusing to buy into the argument of the Trump administration that says that Congress has already enacted laws, had already enacted statutes that allowed presidents to declare economic emergencies and step forth and impose tariffs on various bad actors in the eyes of the executive branch. So with that said, this is a big deal because a major part of Donald Trump's economic plan here is to use tariffs for, at a minimum, 2 things. One is to gain leverage in negotiations with foreign countries that have been misbehaving either by playing around with currency manipulation, by basically imposing tariffs or other trade barriers for American sellers to sell into those markets, or otherwise playing games at the expense of the American worker and American industry. And Donald Trump wants to use these tariffs as leverage to basically balance out or fix the relationship between the United States of America and these various countries. The second thing, of course, is Donald Trump is well aware, in light of what happened with COVID, where countries like India were refusing to sell medical supplies to the United States, even though historically, at least in recent memory, countries like India were largely responsible for manufacturing like generic pharmaceutical products, medical equipment, and so on. And during COVID, there was a period of time where countries like India refused to export these critical items to the United States because the Indian government wanted these items for their own population during COVID. This obviously signaled to all who were informed that this is a big-time problem to have outsourced to foreign countries supply chains that you might need for mission-critical items. For example, it's a really bad idea to be totally dependent on foreign countries for medical supplies, for pharmaceuticals, for guns, for ammunition, for weapon systems, and a whole host of other critical essential products that we need for our national security. And Donald Trump, recognizing this, is working hard to try to bring back to the United States this critical infrastructure that we Americans need, because we don't want to be basically stuck where we were in COVID, where countries that we were historically dependent upon were refusing to sell us goods or trade goods with us because they needed it for their domestic population. We never want to be dependent like that again. This is a big part of Donald Trump's economic policy. Moreover, why are we shipping jobs overseas when we have Americans here that would prefer to do the work themselves. And last, of course, least, we won't get into the details and the benefits of the tariff policy beyond just making a historical observation that until the enactment of the 16th Amendment, basically the 16th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, there was no federal income tax, and the federal government raised all of its revenues to pay for its services and its functions and its employees by virtue of tariffs as a general matter. So it's not as if there's no historical precedent for using tariffs to pay the bills of the federal government, as opposed to what we do now, which is to simply foist that bill onto the backs of hardworking Americans, either through inflationary policies that destroys the value of the dollar in our pockets, or through, of course, taxes themselves. So with all this is a big win for the Trump administration, because the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit that oversees these appeals from the Court of International Trade just said that that three-judge panel that had ruled against Donald Trump, that said that those tariffs were no-go, they were unconstitutional, they were illegal, Donald Trump could not do it, he had to reimburse all the money to these various countries. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit basically said, pause, wait, no. We're going to enjoin, or basically stay, that lower court order until we hear oral argument on the merits of this case, which we're going to do on July 31st, 2025. And we, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, based in Washington, D.C., are going to hear this argument en banc, which means that every active member of the court will participate in this argument and the briefing. And again, the argument is the end of July, and the ruling will come out at some point thereafter. This is specifically what the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit wrote in making this decision today. The United States' motions for a stay of the United States Court of International Trade's rulings enjoining certain executive orders imposing tariffs, the plaintiffs' appellees' oppositions, and the United States' reply were presented to all circuit judges of this court in regular active service who are not recused or disqualified. Both sides have made substantial arguments on the merits. Having considered the traditional stay factors, the court concludes a stay is warranted under the circumstances, and the court also concludes that these cases present issues of exceptional importance warranting expedited en banc consideration of the merits in the first instance. So that was the ruling in VOS Selections versus Donald Trump. There's also a bunch of states involved with this. States like Oregon, Arizona, Colorado, Vermont, New York, Nevada, Minnesota, Illinois, some of the usual suspect anti-Trump states are, of course, trying to attack the Trump tariffs policy because, for obvious reasons, because anything that's anti-Trump, they're going to be on board with. So again, this is obviously another win for President Trump. His argument was do not, he totally disagreed, his administration totally disagreed with the lower court ruling that had basically said the tariffs were unconstitutional and illegal. And not only could he no longer enforce them, he actually had to return all the money to those foreign countries and or companies that had paid the tariffs. President Trump took this immediate appeal asking for a stay, which means a pause of that lower court decision that had found the tariffs were illegal. And the Court of Appeals here said we agree with that stay. The only other point I want to make here, so again, this is a positive thing from the point of view of the Trump administration. I just want to make one other general observation about tariffs. You certainly can debate the good and the bad and the ugly of tariffs. Under the circumstances, I think it's probably a good thing to use these as weapons against some of these foreign countries that have been misbehaving, in particular China, for example. But I do want to make one historical point. I don't want to belabor this point, but I do want to bring something to your attention for those economic geeks out there. There is certainly a historical argument that you learn in high school that the reason why the stock market crash of 1929 gives rise to the Great Depression, so the argument goes, is that you had these Smoot-Hawley tariffs that were enacted by Herbert Hoover, and this caused the Great Depression or deepened the Great Depression after, again, the stock market crash of 1929. Now, this is an oversimplification in a big way, and I don't want to get into all the debate about what caused the Great Depression and what worsened the Great Depression, other than as a general matter, I think I would wholly agree with the thesis that President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was an awful president in all respects, and essentially definitely contributed to the continuation and worsening of the Great Depression. But the point I want to make here about tariffs is this. You will often see people argue against Donald Trump's tariffs by citing to the effects of the Smoot-Hawley tariff bill that was enacted by Congress after 1929, arguing that this was the cause of the Great Depression. But I do want to make a couple other observations as to other contributing factors, if not the causes of the Great Depression and the continuation of it. Obviously, you had massive numbers of bank failures, which, of course, contributed dramatically to the reduction in the money supply. And, one day you have money in the bank and the next day you wake up and all your money is gone because the banks have failed. This obviously does not contribute to economic activity, because now people that thought they had money no longer have savings because they're now totally broke. And of course, it doesn't give rise to confidence among others with the destruction of a lot of these banks. Moreover, and this is one thing I want to bring to your attention because people often don't know this because they were never taught this, that after the stock market crash of 1929, you had something that Congress passed, which was totally stupid, called the Revenue Act of 1932. The reason why I mentioned the Revenue Act of 1932 is because often the liberals, if you will, don't like to talk about this, because what this was a massive increase in the income tax rates all across the board. I mean, for example, the top rate went from 25% of your income all the way up to 63% of your income or marginal income you had to pay to the federal government. So there was a lot of this really extortionate, confiscatory federal taxes as part of this Revenue Act of 1932, which really, arguably, in many respects, was a far more contributing factor of the Great Depression and the economic crash that we saw after the stock market crash of 1929. That was the Revenue Act of 1932. So when you're looking at these debates and people say that tariffs are terrible, they caused the Great Depression, they refer to the Smoot-Hawley Act, also remember there's a lot of other things that were going on there that often get ignored or glossed over by people that want to focus on anti-Trump, anti-tariff arguments. They conveniently skip over the harsh economic effects and bad economic effects of the Revenue Act of 1932, FDR's bad behavior with confiscating gold and so on, and of course all sorts of terrible government intervening policies that made it harder for economic activity to take place. So not only did Hoover contribute this greatly by screwing up with, aggressive raising of taxes and government intervention in the free market, FDR only made it worse when he got into office. And of course, all of that was mostly the policies of really big government activity hurting the economic activity of the private sector. But again, when people talk about Trump's tariffs are terrible, could give rise to the Great Depression and trade wars like the Smoot-Hawley bill, things like this, just remember it's a more complicated economic story than you may have read about in high school. And I just want you to be aware of this. If we need to do a big video for some reason, let me know. I don't think it's mission critical for you to know this, other than to be aware that don't be snowed by very sophomoric arguments about Smoot-Hawley and tariffs always being bad. All right, folks, so there you have it. Hope you learned a little bit something here today about what's going on. Another big court win for Donald Trump. I think he keeps amassing these, and I think it's going to continue, as I predicted a few months ago. And I don't think the Supreme Court is going to be ultimately a problem. I think there's going to be a lot of wins there. So again, don't buy into people that do things and say things about the Supreme Court and other places just for the clicks. It's not always warranted. So I want you to be grounded and criticize people as appropriate, criticize judges as appropriate. That's legitimate, but just make sure you're precise and you don't go over the top and lose credibility in your discussions and your arguments and op-eds, whatever it is that you're doing across this great country. So there you have it, folks, and I look forward to talking to you again real soon here at the Four Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.